So one thing I always love to note, just in general, because I think it is so important, if we really, really care about knowing the truth, one thing that I think we cannot escape in any degree is the question of sociology. And what that also means is how our upbringing and our experiences and the way in which we came into the faith, it will, even years, decades, for the entirety of our life, it does often affect the way in which we do theology. I think this is true both about the way we're raised. It's true about what tradition we were raised in. It's true about where we have we been a Christian our whole lives, or did somebody convert to Christianity later on in life? It will change the way we think about theology. I also think it's true based off of not just, that's more of a sociological question in my mind. I also think it's true in an experiential question. I also think that it's true when it comes to psychology. So I have really become convinced that, like, this is way too broad of a brush I'm going to paint right now, but I hope people get what I'm saying. There are some people who I would say are just naturally addicts, for example. There are some people who are just naturally addicts. And there are some people who really just naturally are not addicts. And it's hard to necessarily, I do think that there's realities of like people's upbringing that affects this, but deep down there are some people who are just addiction is more of a problem for them than for other people. It's just true. My seminary ethics professor pointed this out, and I thought this was so fascinating. I've said this before, but when comparing, like, for example, and by the way, I'm not worthy to untie the shoes of either of these men, so they're obviously both great saints of the church. But if we were to compare St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, I would probably put him in the camp of, I mean, look at his life and his story, somebody who did struggle with addiction pretty seriously. St. Thomas Aquinas, it's not like he lived a perfect life with no problems. I don't think he did live an addict's life. And I don't think that he was tempted towards addiction. If you know some of the stories of how he went into the monastery, he's not, I much more so personally relate to Thomas Aquinas because I'm more wired that way. But I know people who are much more wired like St. Augustine. And what's fascinating then is look at the way that then they parse out their theology. And again, both men are great saints of the church we're indebted to. I'm just saying, in general, I think Augustine is more, I think he's a little less optimistic about, I want to be careful what I say here, but I think he feels the grip of sin more deeply, even as a Christian, than somebody like Aquinas probably did. And again, I'm painting with too broad of a brush here, so forgive me if I'm not saying this right. But my point is, I almost see a difference here of like Calvinism versus Wesleyanism. There kind of is a difference of approach here a little bit, as like how optimistic can we be that the gospel frees us from sin so we can actually go out and do the bidding of God. I do think that some of that comes down to psychology and some of it comes down to our experience. So for example, I totally relate to what he's saying here because I was raised in the church. And so I find that my experience and even my encounter with Christianity is very different from some other people that I meet who came to Christianity later in life. And the way that they approach the questions may be different because of our different experiences. Another just quick example I'd give, and again, I want to be really careful how I say this, but speaking as an Anglican, this is too broad of a brush again, but those who grow up in the English tradition, so they grow up as Methodists or they grow up as Anglicans, or even to some degree, it's not in the Anglican tradition, but Pentecostalism is like downstream from Methodism. Kind of got like granddaddy Anglicanism, the daddy Methodism, and the child is Pentecostalism. You see, it's a different flavor of doing theology than people who grow up Reformed or Calvinist, or, you know what I mean? They just grew up with a different paradigm. And what's fascinating is, so when I see people who move from like a Reformed background into Anglicanism, the way they think about Anglicanism, in my view, to some degree, not always, but it oftentimes reflects the Reformed categories that they had. It feels a little bit more black and white to me. Whereas people like me who grew up in Methodism, and I think of like the 20th century, the great Anglican figures. If you want to read a book on this, there's a great book called The Anglican Spirit by Arthur Michael Ramsey, where he works through this. Great people in like the Church of England over the last 100 plus years, they think in a different categories. So this is why, like, in general, Anglicanism is more pro-modern science. Certainly, like, again, historic Anglicans, like people who grew up with an English mind. And this comes out of a movement in the late 19th century called the Lux Mundi movement. But it's kind of, there's just kind of this openness to like all truth. It's less of like black, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to other groups, but it's less about like black and white battlegrounds. Like, if not this, then this, and like that's a little bit more of a reformed thing. This, like, if it's not this, it's this, and it's more black and white. Whereas the historic Anglican mind is able to like kind of draw in a wider variety of ways of thinking, in my opinion. And that can be to its detriment and to its benefit, by the way. So both can have, but I obviously think the English way is I think it's a, I think I can say this. I think it's a superior way to think. It's more contextual and historically based rather than systematic. And again, I don't say that to denigrate. I'm just trying to be really honest, help people think through this. So when you even look at people within the same tradition, and why does one person think this way and why does one person think this way, and they both seem to be really trying to assess the data, sometimes the answer lies in sociology, and it lies in their own psychology. It lies in what tradition they were raised in. It lies in whether they converted as an even older child or older youth, or were they brought up in the church. And I also think it has to do with, do they have a naturally addictive or a naturally not addictive personality? And all of these things do play into how we form our own theology. Now, in my mind, God can use both for his full will. Like, people with different dispositions and different approaches to theology can both bring important perspectives to a reality. That doesn't mean that there's still one coherent capital T truth that we can search for. And I try to do that. But if we're even aware of the fact that we have these things in our backgrounds and that other people have them, it at least opens our mind to see a more full truth, I would contend. So it's an interesting thought perspective, I would say. Yeah. Oh, real quick, before I go on, I want to say this. So yeah, Quay, I totally get this, man. This is also, and then I'll get back to the end of this sermon, guys, because the end is really poignant and powerful and beautiful. And I quote it a lot. But yeah, I totally agree with this. I think this is tough because, how do I say this? I also don't want to make this a racial thing. I do think there's also racial components to this, right? Like at least in the area I live, Quay, a lot of the Roman Catholics are they're either Irish or they're Hispanic, they're Mexican in general. I mean, not obviously there's a larger, but like when I meet like these large swaths of people in Denver who are Hispanic Roman Catholics, their approach to it, like it's very different than if you meet like an evangelical who went in. They bring kind of some of they like in some ways are reacting against what they grew up with. And so they become very strong proponents for something that they may not fully understand. This is true in Anglicanism too, Quay, maybe even to a greater degree. So many people in Anglicanism today were actually Reformed or they were evangelicals. And so they come in Anglicanism and they perceive that you do the same sort of methodology. And Anglicans just historically don't. It's a much broader way of looking at things. And I say this respectfully, but I would say most people who are historically Anglican or Methodist are more ecumenical, I would say, in general, or they're more pro trying to find points of convergence. And I see this in a lot of people. I just recently, the last video I made, I mentioned somebody named Ryan Danker, who runs the John Wesley Institute, and he's an Anglo-Catholic Episcopalian, very orthodox, but brilliant. I mean, he's taught at seminary level. But anyways, my point is that when I look at him and I think about the people I spoke to, like Quay, all the people I spoke to when I was wrestling with where to go ecclesiologically, none of them had any problems with saying like, yeah, we could support people going to Roman Catholicism. We can support people going to Eastern Orthodoxy. We can support people going to Anglicanism. We can support people staying here. Like they just have a different way of thinking about it. Whereas sometimes if you like, I for 1 year, and God bless this place, but for 1 year I did a youth ministry position at an evangelical Presbyterian church. And I can tell you the Bible studies there were super different in the way they approached the questions of how do you deal with Rome? How do you deal with the Reformation? How do you approach questions? And so it's just interesting to me. In Anglicanism, I think this is true too. There's like an influx of people from other traditions. They're oftentimes not even aware. I'm not, again, saying this to say like, I've got it all figured out and they don't or something. I'm just saying some people are cognizant of this. Some people I don't think are. that they think in a certain paradigm. And so sometimes I'm dialoguing with people and I'm like, it's hard for me to even understand your methodology because I just don't think that way. Like, I don't think in these reformed categories. I think in Catholic categories, which Wesleyanism and Anglicanism, I'd say historically thinks in Catholic categories. So they think differently. And so anyways, you see this in Eastern Orthodoxy too, right? I mean, it's maybe even more prominent in Eastern Orthodoxy than anywhere else. This notion of like, you've got like the old school Greeks and Antiochians and the Russians, and then you've got all these like white people coming in, or they're not just white, but all these like American people coming in, and from a Protestant background, they don't necessarily understand. So they try to bring Reformed thinking into Eastern Orthodoxy, but Eastern Orthodoxy thinks in a much more mystical way. They're not necessarily using all these categories the way that Protestants do. So anyway, it's an interesting thing. Again, none of that's to like just degrade where people have been or something. It's just I don't think you can get really serious theologically to the fullest degree until you start to reflect on these things and why different people who can be equally learned and equally sincere, why can they come to different conclusions? And then what do we do with that? Right. And I guess just one last quote. I quote this all the time from C.S. Lewis, but I'm going to keep saying it till the cows come home because it's just like, it's the truth. He says, I'll try to quote this real quick. He's speaking to his Roman Catholic friend, Don Giovanni Calabria. And he says, I do not hold it to be certain that all schism is done in sin. He says, I grant that no schism is without sin, but the one proposition does not necessarily lead to the other. He says, what would I do with your St. Thomas More and our William Tyndale? He says, all the writings of the one and all the writings of the other I've lately read right through, and both of them seem to me most saintly men, and to have loved God with their whole hearts. So he's talking about a Roman Catholic here and one of the famous Anglicans, right? And he's, well, kind of proto-Anglicans. And he says, I'm not worthy to undo the shoes of either man. He says, yet what racks and astounds me is that their disagreement does not seem to me to spring from their vices nor from their ignorance. So it's not like one of them's just a drunkard, or it's not like one of them's just super ignorant and the other one's don't. He says, but rather their dissension seems to come about from their virtues. And he says, so that the more they were at their best, the more they were at variance. It seems to me that, and then he says, it seems to me that the discernment of God on their dissension is more profoundly hidden to you than it appears to be. For indeed, his judgments are an abyss. You can see right there in C.S. Lewis's thinking, that is Anglican thinking. That's exactly what I've been espousing. But it's something that you have to get outside of kind of the black and white category world to get into that. So like, I'll just say this real quick. I won't go off on a riff here, but I've even thought about this myself, guys. So yeah, I don't want to speak for anybody else here, but like Quay, I think about this because, for example, Quay, if you and I sat down and went out to lunch and we just talked about every speck of our theology, I think you'd find, and by the way, my friend Quay is a Roman Catholic. I think you'd find really hard to find places that we disagree about something. But I grew up in the Methodist world. And I know you actually did too, Quay, which is interesting. So it'd be interesting to talk more about this. But for me, it made sense to just move up the candlestick into the Catholic form of my own tradition, which is Anglicanism. Whereas people who grew up as evangelicals, it totally makes sense to me that when they look at the Christian landscape and they become convinced of more Catholic things, it totally makes sense to me why they would become Roman Catholic. Anglicanism, you look at it and you go, okay, look at the disaster. It's messy. It's deeply misunderstood in so many ways. It can be a mess. I totally understand why people go from evangelicalism to Roman Catholicism. But I also understand why people go from Methodism into high church, Catholic, eclectic Anglicanism. And what's interesting is I'm not sure it's really a different principle that leads to those decisions ultimately. I know people, again, this is kind of people get really big on the, well, what about the papacy and infallibility and magisterial things? I won't get into that right now. But my point is, even some of those questions do seem to me to have some Reformed underpinnings. Now, obviously, they go beyond Reformed underpinnings because the, Thomist thought has some places with that too, has some place for that, of course. But it's interesting to me. One other thing, and then I'll go back to the video here. But my philosophy professor at seminary, who was absolutely brilliant, said this to me once. He said, Americans, whether they even know it or not, Americans swim in Reformed waters. They swim in black or white waters. They just do. And so when people go anywhere, they kind of they're that's just the natural ocean in America, is like reformed black and white thinking, sort of. Okay. And so when you're drawn into another paradigm, it does take like a reflection upon, why might I think differently from other people here? And then how can I still know that they're acting in good faith? And how do I express that I'm acting in good faith? And we keep working at these things. And that's an important reflection. So, anyways, it's interesting. I would also say that Reformed thinking is also a very German way of doing theology. So if anybody knows, there's kind of two older European schools of thought to some degree, certainly at least within the Protestant or Reformed world. There's the English school and there's the German school. There's obviously other Reformed schools too, but I'm just saying there's kind of this back and forth. And the Germans do theology differently than the English do historically. And it's interesting. I'd say the German way is closer to the Reformed way I've been talking about, and the English way is closer to, I'd say an eclectic kind of ecumenical way. And so, again, that doesn't solve everything. And usually these kind of questions are not going to solve things, but they do. They open our mind. It's almost like, I think of it like mental massaging. It like massages our brains to think in a different way. And then it allows us to think in different ways. Now, obviously, in Anglicanism, that can lead to extreme catastrophe where everything goes out of the window, but it can also lead to like really deep truth. So again, it's kind of it's twin sides of a pole. It's like it can be really, really true, or it can be really, really disastrous. That's kind of what Anglicanism can be, in my view. But anyways, that's enough of a ramble. But real quick before I go on, I want to say this. Thanks, Prodigals, for sharing your story, man. All right, real quick before I go back, I want to, saying that English will do anything well with an Irishman in a room is bold. That's great. That's funny, man. I love it. See, and it's funny. I'm saying this, but I'm kind of like, my heritage is like half Scottish. My last name is Armstrong. The Armstrongs are from the borderlands of England and Scotland. So I'm like, but we have like a Scottish, tartan and coat of arms. So I'm like half Scottish, and my mom's side's Pennsylvania Dutch German. So, so that's funny. Oh man. All right, real quick. So my friend says, I've gone from black and white to all gray, black and white, but always leaving open that I might be mistaken. And I think that that's fair. And by the way, I want to be careful, because I think as I'm saying this, it might come across very like dismissive of black and white systematic thinking. Again, in my view, I'd hold the Romans 9-11 principle. God can humble both sides to learn something from the other. So when a side is very English in the way I was saying, sometimes it can start looking like the Anglican Church does today, which is a mess. So there's a place for systematic theology to sometimes have boundaries, and you could think of it like bowling lanes, where it's like, okay, you've got a wide variety of place here to throw your bowling ball to hit the pins, but there's a lane here and a gutter here and a gutter here that we do not cross. Okay, that can be a helpful thing of systematic theology. Whereas the English model can help bring people sometimes out of very like, it brings them into another world, where the best analogy I can think of is it takes them from thinking that the sky is a cloud to thinking that to seeing that the sky is bigger than the cloud. Anglicanism can do that. It sucks in light from different places, and English Christianity does that. And it also focuses more on the liturgy and on eschatology, which is the way that God draws us into oneness beyond chaos. So anyways, I think both can actually learn from each other.